right now, multi-million-dollar energy and infrastructure networks across the United States are grinding to a sudden halt. Massive corporations face criminal indictments, prison sentence, and catastrophic federal penalties. This isn't an economic recession. It is the work of a microscopic organism, granted supreme federal protection, capable of freezing industrial expansion instantly. Why exactly does an economic superpower paralyze its own development to protect a biological killer for years? Mainstream media insisted that saving bees secures our global food supply, but a massive fracture in the system reveals an ugly truth. Our mechanical conservation efforts are actually weaponizing nature against itself. This is how a hidden parasite transformed into a multi-billion-dollar legal bomb under the Endangered Species Act, bringing civil fines of $25,000 and criminal prosecution to anyone in its way. This is the raw truth of what is actually killing all the bees in the United States. To understand this gridlock, you have to look at the law. The U.S. Endangered Species Act isn't a gentle guideline. It's an absolute veto over human development. Federal law dictates that harming a protected species includes modifying its habitat. If a project alters empty dirt in a way that disrupts an insect's feeding or nesting, the law drops an unyielding mechanical brake. It doesn't care if the destruction was accidental or if a massive contract is on the line. This isn't a theoretical threat. Look at the California desert in 2026. A massive green energy solar project was nearly complete, until engineers discovered the high-voltage transmission lines crossed the final sanctuary of a rare, wild ground-nesting bee. The project froze indefinitely. Moving the bees was illegal. Workers had to fundamentally redesign battery facilities and reroute miles of heavy infrastructure, blowing past budgets and draining hundreds of millions of dollars in unexpected losses. The legal teeth of the act are sharp civil violations, cost $25,000 each, while knowingly pushing forward triggers criminal fines of $50,000 and actual prison time. The tiny inhabitants of the soil are now the most terrifying liabilities on a corporate balance sheet. But this legal trap originates far beyond a single construction site. It stems from the heart of the American food supply, the Pacific Northwest. Here, nearly 40 million acres of land have been flattened into a massive industrial machine, a process of eco-colonialism that strips away natural variation for corporate profit. These millions of acres form a monoculture dead zone. For a brief window, identical crops bloom simultaneously, but once that window closes, the landscape instantly hardens into a biological desert for the remaining 10 months of the year, leaving zero food or nesting grounds for native insects. Because this machine destroyed the permanent habitats wild bees need to survive, the market engineered a mechanical substitute. Pollinators were stripped of their ecological roles and reclassified as factory components. Today, commercial honeybees are bred in facilities, loaded into uniform shipping crates, and trucked thousands of miles to be discharged into dead zones at the exact hour a crop requires them. But replacing a balanced ecosystem with a rigid corporate supply chain exposed a lethal blind spot, triggering the exact chain reaction now killing America's bees. You have probably seen the slogan countless times on billboards, corporate ads, and social media campaigns, "Save the bees." It sounds noble. It inspired millions of well-meaning citizens to set up amateur hives in their backyards, while massive corporations funded beekeeping initiatives to showcase their environmental consciousness. But from a biological standpoint, this entire movement is built on a massive mathematical lie. The insects these campaigns are saving do not need protection. The European honeybee is not a wild creature fighting extinction. It is livestock. It is literally winged cattle, managed and exploited under an industrial framework. Caring about biodiversity by breeding more honeybees is exactly like trying to save endangered wild songbirds by raising millions of commercial chickens. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet, the public bought into the illusion. The latest agricultural census by the United States Department of Agriculture exposed the terrifying scale of this intervention. The USDA found a record-breaking 388 million commercial honeybee colonies operating inside the United States. That is a massive 25% surge in just a 5-year window. Public sentiment wanted to multiply the bees, and they succeeded. The problem is they multiplied the wrong species. When an industrial operation drops tens of thousands of commercial hives into a landscape all at once, it triggers an environmental catastrophe. These millions of introduced foragers create an absolute consumption storm. They sweep across the fields, draining every microgram of nectar and stripping away the pollen supply for the wild and native species that lived on this land for millennia. The result is immediate, invisible starvation. They are locked out of their own evolutionary feeding grounds by an overwhelming army of commercial invaders. But the true horror of this manufactured boom lies in how human greed structurally altered the biology of the honeybee itself. Historically, bees possessed a natural line of defense against parasites, intensive grooming behavior. They would systematically clean their bodies and physically remove pests. However, this natural survival mechanism was highly inconvenient for industrial keepers. A bee spending its energy grooming is a bee spending less time flying, collecting nectar, and generating profit. To fix this efficiency leak, commercial breeders spent centuries selectively breeding honeybees to suppress this natural grooming trait. Humans intentionally engineered away the insect's natural defense mechanism to maximize market yield. The biological bill for that corporate decision has now come due, deprived of their primary defense. Commercial honeybee populations became completely defenseless against their greatest nightmare, the parasitic varroa mite. The hives transformed into massive, highly concentrated factories for disease and lethal viruses. And because the modern agricultural machine requires these insects to function, the industry created a perfect logistical superspreading network. Every spring, transport trucks pack up millions of these infected commercial colonies and haul them across interstate highways to pollinate the massive almond groves of California. By late summer, those exact same hives are loaded back up and shipped across the country to work the intensive apple orchards of Washington state. As this highly contaminated commercial population is marched across the country, they constantly cross paths with vulnerable, wild native species. The domestic livestock leaves behind an invisible trail of lethal pathogens on every flower they touch. The viruses escape the commercial farms, enter the wild ecosystem, and begin systematically destroying the immune systems of the native populations. The very asset engineered to secure our food supply has become a biological weapon, quietly executing the true, silent architects of the American wild. But if commercial honeybees are dominating the fields, why did the federal government deploy its most aggressive legal shield to protect an insect that produces absolutely no honey? That brings us to the hidden variable of this entire crisis. The phantom entity holding the emergency brake over the American economy isn't an ordinary pollinator. It is Bombus sucklei, commonly known as Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee. For years, this insect slipped completely under the radar of industrial agriculture. It didn't belong to any multi-million-dollar commercial registry, and it didn't interest the major breeders. Yet, its sudden collapse forced federal authorities to step in, altering the industrial landscape overnight. To understand why this organism triggered a legal lockdown, you have to look at how it actually survives. If you examine its anatomy under a microscope, you will notice a bizarre biological deficiency. Bombus sucklei has no pollen baskets on its hind legs. It is physically incapable of gathering resources, collecting food, or provisioning a colony. It cannot secrete wax to construct a home, and it has no worker caste of its own. In the strict logic of human morality, this insect is a ruthless villain. It is an obligate social parasite. A fertile female infiltrates a fully established nest belonging to a different, wild native bumblebee species. Once inside, she aggressively subdues or executes the resident queen, takes absolute control of the workforce, and uses potent chemical signals to enslave the colony. The host workers spend the rest of their lives foraging to feed the parasite's offspring, completely unaware that their entire lineage has been hijacked by a tiny biological dictator. In human society, we might celebrate the downfall of a ruthless criminal, but ecosystems do not operate on human morality. In nature, the health of a top-tier parasite is the ultimate metric for the stability of the entire system. A specialist parasite can only exist if its host population is incredibly wealthy in numbers and deeply stable. If the host colonies begin to decline, the parasite is automatically the first to starve. Therefore, when scientists realized that Bombus sucklei was vanishing from the continent, it wasn't a sign that a pest was being defeated. It was a terrifying diagnostic report indicating that the foundational infrastructure of wild native bees had completely fractured. The numbers confirm the catastrophe. The overall population of Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee has plummeted by a staggering 77% compared to its historical baselines. It has lost more than half of its former geographical range across North America. The collapse is so absolute that when researchers in Ontario spent several consecutive years launching targeted field surveys specifically to locate a single specimen, they came up completely empty-handed. The parasite had effectively become a ghost. It wasn't dying because humans were hunting it directly. It was dying because the unregulated expansion of commercial bee livestock had flooded the wild with weaponized pathogens, quietly wiping out the wild host colonies that this parasite required to survive. The disappearance of the killer was the ultimate proof that the entire biological chain was breaking down, forcing the federal government to intervene before the collapse reached the core of American food production. Facing a breakdown of this scale, the intuitive reaction might be to call for a complete halt to industrial farming or a total ban on commercial beekeeping. But let's be realistic. We cannot roll back the clock to a pre-industrial era. A nation of over 300 million people cannot simply stop producing food, and global supply chains cannot survive on romantic ideals of untouched wilderness. If the solution requires erasing modern infrastructure, then the solution is dead on arrival. We need a design that acknowledges reality. We need a mechanism that works with the industrial machine, not against it. That is exactly what led to an unexpected strategy proposed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. To find an answer, regulators stopped looking at pristine nature reserves and started looking at the very veins of human industrialization. Across the United States, millions of acres of land are permanently set aside for linear infrastructure. Think about high-voltage power line networks, oil and gas pipelines, railroad rights-of-way, and the wide grassy medians splitting interstate highways. Historically, these zones were viewed as ecological scars, barren strips of cleared earth, slicing through landscapes. But look closer, and your perspective completely shifts. These industrial strips represent a hidden, continent-spanning network of undisturbed soil. By law, they must be kept clear of trees and heavy forest growth to protect the infrastructure underneath. They are routinely mowed, kept free from the constant tilling of industrial tractors, and most importantly, they are completely isolated from the massive pesticide cycles of commercial agriculture. In a country where natural meadows have been systematically transformed into monoculture dead zones, these industrial corridors are accidentally the most secure, chemical-free sanctuaries left on the continent. This realization unlocked a powerful macroeconomic leverage mechanism. The government realized it could use the terrifying authority of the Endangered Species Act as a tool for proactive compromise. Instead of waiting for a wild bee species to hit absolute crisis and then freezing projects by force, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approached major energy and transportation sectors with a definitive deal. If these corporations voluntarily alter their land management practices now, by planting native wildflower seeds and adjusting their mowing schedules to match natural reproductive cycles, the government provides them with an absolute legal guarantee. This corporate protection compromise ensures that if a wild pollinator found in these corridors is later placed on the federal endangered list, the participating companies are legally shielded. They will not face unexpected construction freezes. Their budgets will not be upended, and they get clear, predictable operational rules for the next several decades. For a utility company, spending a fraction of their maintenance budget on native seeds is an incredibly cheap insurance policy compared to a multi-million-dollar asset shutdown under the ESA. It turns environmental restoration from an expensive bureaucratic hurdle into a calculated risk mitigation strategy. If companies refuse to cooperate, the financial trap remains open, waiting to swallow their next project. But for those who sign on, these cold corridors of steel and wire are transformed into the ultimate safe passage for the wild survivors of the American landscape. Ultimately, this entire crisis forces us to look in the mirror. The true killer of bees in the United States is not a natural disaster. a biological accident, or a single vicious insect. The killer is our own greed. The assumption that we can force the ancient laws of natural evolution to follow the strict logic of the commercial market. We tried to operate a living ecosystem like a factory assembly line. We bred, transported, and manipulated and introduced species for profit. And we accidentally turned a useful tool into a super-spreading disease weapon. To repair a broken causal chain, we must look at the smallest links. You do not need to buy commercial hives or become an amateur beekeeper to save the environment. In fact, adding more managed bee colonies to the landscape only accelerates the starvation of wild species. Instead, the real leverage begins right outside your door, in your own yard. The solution is simple, and it directly challenges our idea of a clean neighborhood. Stop cutting your grass down into a perfectly manicured green carpet. A uniform lawn is a dead zone for wild insects. Let the grass grow a little. Plant a wildflower garden patch filled with native species that local pollinators depend on. Leave a small section of bare soil where ground-nesting bees can safely dig their homes. Do not use chemical insecticides on your plants, and avoid purchasing food grown with them. Wild pollinators do not need complex corporate management. They simply need an ordinary place with food, as a spot to build a nest, and an environment where humans stop poisoning them. These backyard actions are tied to a strict federal timeline. Exactly 10 years after these community programs and infrastructure partnerships begin, federal researchers will conduct a separate, nationwide review of the ecosystem. This comprehensive audit will analyze field data to determine whether these combined efforts have successfully halted the decay of native insect populations or if the chain is still breaking down. This delivers the final answer to our question. The government is not protecting a strange insect killer out of confusion. It is protecting a parasite because that parasite serves as the ultimate symptom of a much larger systemic failure. Tearing down a parasite does not save the hive if the entire environment is toxic. When we try to replace natural evolution with market logic, the entire system collapses. Saving the parasite is the only way to prove we have saved the host, and saving that host is the only way to secure the food supply of the country. See you in the next video.